Welcome to episode 3 of A Little More Conversation with myself, Martin Clancy, and Noel Tate, where we'll be taking a look at Elvis's third studio album. It's called Elvis's Christmas Album, and it's actually one of the best-selling, actually I need to change that, the best-selling Christmas album of all time, with over 20 million units sold in the US alone, released in 1957. And Noel Tate, who joins me now, has been taking a listen to some of the King's classics.
I have, yeah. So, and I had to go and fact check you last week when you told me it was the best-selling Christmas album of all time, and you're right, it is. Yeah, a crazy amount. I couldn't believe it because obviously, like you know all the best-selling Christmas songs, so White Christmas and so on. But I just never dawned on me that this album was up there, and it's actually, you were right as well. It's one of the best-selling albums of all time. Never mind just Christmas albums. Yeah. So yeah, listen to it a few times throughout the week. And yeah, it's just a really nice Christmas album. I don't know why I'd never listened to the whole thing before.
Yeah, no, it's a great Christmas album, and it jockeys between kind of Christmas classics, some upbeat, some slow tempo, and some spirituals as well. And the spirituals are really interesting, as Elvis's only Grammy nominations and Grammy wins were all for spiritual recordings, which we'll come to later in this series. But a brilliant album, recorded in 1957, at the start of 57, released in October of that year. And it came at a really interesting juncture in Elvis's life, because in and around the same time of this, Elvis had just finished Jailhouse Rock, and he was preparing to go into the army. So the next album after this is actually Elvis Is Back, which is celebrating his return from Germany. So it's a crucial juncture in Elvis's life. The success of it is phenomenal, and still selling huge amount of units to this day. And it contains some real Christmas classics on it, and some songs that become synonymous with Elvis, especially around Christmas time. The standout, I think, has to be Blue Christmas. It's probably Elvis's most famous Christmas song, and a real Christmas classic. Performed live very sparingly. There's a live recording of it from the 68 Comeback Special in 1968, and he performed it one or two times on stage. I can certainly recall him performing it in Las Vegas. I think it was in 1975 or 1976 on stage, but certainly not a song that he sang too much live. And I suppose that's understandable, because it's such a Christmas classic. You'd probably only sing it around that time of the year. But a fantastic song. For me, I think my favorite song on the album is I'll Be Home for Christmas. That certainly is one that I just absolutely love. And Santa Bring My Baby Back to Me, probably a close second. Of course, Blue Christmas, though, the standout recording from the King on this album. And what did you think of the songs, the track listing, and what kind of stood out for you?
So I thought, I'd mentioned the last few weeks that I thought that I suppose the order of the albums was a little bit off. You were really fast and really slow, really fast, really slow, and it was kind of hard to follow it. This one, I thought the track listings were really nicely arranged, and it started off with I think 6 Christmas songs, then a couple of carols, and then into the gospel religious songs. But the first song, Santa Claus Is Back in Town, I loved how he just brought that rock feel straight into his Christmas album. There's that's just kind of classic Elvis rock that we'd heard in the last 2 albums, but like in Christmas form. I thought that was really nice. Then kind of going through the listings, White Christmas, I liked, but obviously the dominant version of White Christmas that everybody knows, it's such an iconic version. It's hard to live up to that. So I did like, but in my head I was always comparing it to that one. The Bing Crosby one is the one I'm talking about. And then Here Comes Santa Claus. I love that song. I'll Be Home for Christmas. I've had that marked as kind of in my top favorites as well. Blue Christmas, just great. Obviously, I knew that song. I didn't realize how well I knew that song. But yeah, just a fantastic song. And then the last of the kind of Christmassy songs, Santa Bring My Baby Back, just this really nice, upbeat, kind of really positive Christmas song. Then into the Christmas carols, O Little Town of Bethlehem, Silent Night, which I really, really like this version of Silent Night. I don't know why. I've always loved the song Silent Night. I honestly have no idea why. I've always kind of took a liking to it, whether it's a Christmas concert in school when I was younger, or heard it on the radio coming up to Christmas or whatever. But I really liked Elvis's version, and as I listened to it, I realized that I'd heard it a few times before. So I really like that one. And then onto the gospel songs, which I have to be honest, I didn't really like or get the first time I listened to, but I forced my way to listen to them a few more times, and they do kind of like a lot of the kind of earlier stuff, which I didn't think I'd like straight away. They do kind of grow on you. In particular, I Believe. Thought it was a great song. The more you listen to it, just the more kind of just resonated as just this kind of like really, really nice song. And I wouldn't be too religious a person, but when you kind of take the religious aspect out, it is just a nice song. The others, I have to say, didn't really grow on me as much, but I did think that kind of it kind of showed me that some of the Elvis gospel music, okay, there's something there that you might like. That's kind of what that said to me. But yeah, I just thought it was a really nicely arranged album. Started off with all the Christmas songs, the Christmas carols, and then onto the gospel songs to finish off.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, as I said, Elvis's spirituals and his gospel recordings were the ones that he got his Grammy nominations for and Grammy wins for, which would occur like over the coming years for him after this album was recorded. What's interesting is the gospel songs were all recorded in January 57, so just after his birthday that year. And then the rest of the kind of real Christmassy tracks were recorded in September of 57. It's one of two Christmas albums that Elvis recorded during his lifetime. Elvis sings The Wonderful World of Christmas, if I'm not mistaken, was his other Christmas album that came out in 1971, recorded in Nashville. And I think that album actually was recorded in the middle of the summer, something around August, but they put a Christmas tree up in the studio and Christmas presents to try and get that festive theme in the studio when they recorded that album. But and such an interesting period in his life because, he finished his first three pictures, Love Me Tender, Loving You, Jailhouse Rock. He was about to record King Creole, and then he'd be gone. He would be gone into the army. Elvis's next appearance on the silver screen would be GI Blues once he re-emerges. His next album after this is Elvis Is Back. So there's a real hiatus that occurs shortly after this album is recorded. One of the interesting things that Colonel Parker did, knowing that Elvis was going into the service, was he got Elvis into the studio to record a lot of material that they put in the can and then that they put out while Elvis was away so that he wouldn't be missed too much, because both Elvis and his fans and indeed RCA were slightly nervous with Elvis being away for 2 years. Would rock and roll survive was the first question. Would Elvis remain as popular be the second question. And they were scared of having a 2-year blank period for Elvis could have been detrimental to his career. And it's a concern, certainly, from what his friends have said, that Elvis shared. He was worried about what would happen over this time period with him away. So what they did was they recorded a lot of material which they were able to drip feed onto the market and put out while he was away, which kept him relevant, kept him in the charts, and kept that same style that he had in the 50s alive for the rest of the 50s and into the very early 60s. Then I think when Elvis reemerges, post-Germany, it's certainly a much more polished performer. The rawness of the Sun era, the rawness of the early albums starts to dissipate, and he ventures more into ballads and becoming a very powerful, strong singer. Not saying he wasn't beforehand, but I think certainly his voice matures over these coming years. Right. And this album is kind of pivotal in that because it nearly jockeys the early rawness, as you said, of the rock and roll, with the opening track in this. And then it segues into the spirituals, which certainly then became kind of a theme for Elvis later in the 60s and 70s as far as his recording is concerned. So it's an interesting juncture in his life. The album certainly surpassed everybody's expectations as to the success of it. For the fact that it's the best Christmas album in the world, to this day, and it was recorded in 1957, is like, it's mind blowing. It's testimony to Elvis's artistic creativity, but also the foresight of RCA and the Colonel as well. Colonel knew that these types of records had longevity in them, and certainly later on in Elvis's career, when it came to the '68 comeback special, which was broadcast, in and around the holiday time period, Colonel wanted all Christmas songs like that. Elvis pushed back very strongly. One of the few times that he did against Colonel Parker, and recorded just the one as a compromise, which is Blue Christmas. So it's interesting. It's certainly a very good album to listen to, especially in the holiday time period, and something that, with Blue Christmas, contains an absolute classic that makes the airwaves, across the globe, from kind of early December, late November, early December, right through to Christmas Eve and Christmas Day.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And you touch on a few things there I want to go back and cover. So regarding the kind of gospel spiritual aspect, which we know in Elvis' later career, he had whole albums dedicated to gospel. And we talked over the last few weeks about how before he got into rock, he was very focused on gospel, and he was a fan of that type of music all the way through his career. What was the kind of where did this decision come to have the gospel songs added onto this album? Because I do feel a bit like, okay, we're going to do a Christmas album and then put some gospel songs on the end. So where did the decision come to add them onto this album and introduce the world, I suppose, to Elvis gospel?
Yeah, so that had been a decision primarily from RCA and from Steve Scholes, who was the producer, along with Colonel Parker, to include the spiritual songs in it. I suppose it's important to remember as well that this was 1957. It was an album that was recorded by an artist from the South in the US, Elvis Presley, and spiritual music was ingrained in Elvis's DNA, and in kind of Southern gospel music as well. So it's not unusual that they would have made this decision to include the spiritual tracks in the album, and especially as it was such a spiritual time of the year as well, being around Christmas time. I suppose looking at it through the prism of today, you'd kind of wonder, why don't you just keep it all upbeat, Christmas feel-good songs? But I think it's just a very nice touch towards the end of the album, and it kind of brings into focus the whole spiritual aspect of the holiday, the Christmas holiday season and the Christmas holiday time period. And yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, gospel music was such a huge part of Elvis's life before he even became famous, and right through his career, all the way through his career. I mean, when Elvis was playing Vegas, he famously said that they would go up and sing gospel songs all night after he completed 2 or on some occasions 3 shows a night at the International or the Hilton in Vegas, which is just a grueling schedule if you think you have to be on stage 3 times a day. He said it took a lot to mind, and gospel music was the way that he did that.
Yeah, and he was still, sorry, I know we're, this is for future episodes, but he was still going off and doing recordings then, and doing other playing in other places, and so staying on the gospel just for a second, because I did mention that a few of the songs didn't really resonate with me as songs, but as you were listening to them, one thing that was really apparent is I suppose he put a lot of emotion into those songs. It wasn't just like he was going through and singing them technically well. I mentioned last week that I always kind of appreciate when you can tell the emotion coming through from an artist, and that's something you definitely got in those songs. Definitely more so than early on than the earlier songs in the album. But and it just seems to really be ingrained in his soul, and I suppose it's the first indication of that.
That's right, and you hit upon the key word there. I think soul. He sings those songs with so much soul in them. It's a very unique aspect of Elvis's, in my opinion, artistic creativity, that the emotion and his emotional connection to the songs comes out in his vocal performances, especially on gospel music. You can just sense how much they mean to him when he's recording them. So it's something that I think for listeners, and then like later on we'll be able to talk about it more so when we're covering just the gospel albums that he records. But it's the soul and the emotional attachment he has to those songs that really does shine through.
Yeah. Okay, so because there's about 20 different talking points we have here, but before we get too far away from this particular album, there's one clip I want to go back and play, and I'm sure you'd have seen this before. So we're going to play it now.
Sounds like having a discussion about a subject close to their hearts. It's Elvis Presley and his exciting new RCA Victor Christmas album. They were listening to Elvis singing delightful holiday season songs like Peace in the Valley.
There will be peace in the valley.
Also, White Christmas, Here Comes Santa Claus, a full dozen seasonal favorites. And then it happened. The girls discovered 9 full-color photographs of Elvis right in the album. Now, how do you divide 9 pictures of Elvis evenly between 2 girls? Big Sis has one answer. 5 for little Sis, 4 for herself, and to even it off, she's going to buy Elvis' latest pop recording of Treat Me Nice. And that does it. Everybody seems to be happy, and so will you too, when you hear the new Elvis Christmas album at your RCA Victor dealers now.
Great.
So were you able to hear that okay?
It was, yeah.
Yeah, and this is, so I'm sure people realize, but it was actually, this was a television advertisement for this album. And it's really something you don't see too much of nowadays. It does happen. You see TV ads for a new album, but this was just, it's very kind of infomercial type style. And he's opening it up and showing the pictures with Elvis' a big smile on it, trying to sell them as well. They give you a little bit of a snippet from the actual track too. And then one thing which is very apparent here. So I'd say most artists who release songs today, if you listed the top 20 selling artists today, maybe one I could tell you what label they're on. Here, RCA Victor is, every time Elvis mentions a new album, every time there's an advert somewhere, it's RCA Victor is plastered all over it. They really sell the label along with the album. Yeah.
Well, RCA were the label in the 50s. They were the largest label in the United States. It was a real stamp of authority and kind of kudos to be a RCA Victor recording artist. I mean, It was the best of the best for RCA Victor recording artists. So it was nearly like if you were on RCA, it was nearly like the critics agreed that you were a worthwhile listen. One thing that really stood out for me in that infomercial, though, is the fact that it's quite evident they're trying to promote Elvis to a different audience, along with the teenagers. They're trying with the gospel music to promote Elvis to the older audience, which is a very smart marketing move, because that was an audience that they hadn't captured at that point. So, like, the fact it's a Christmas album, but they use the spiritual song "There'll Be Peace in the Valley" or "Peace in the Valley" as the audio clip is really, really smart, because it's capturing a whole new demographic for Elvis. And that's something that then became part of his career going forward, because if you remember early on when we were talking, it was the devil's music and people didn't like it, or certain cohorts of the population didn't like it.
Yeah,
they felt very threatened by it and his movements, etc. And this again is a pivotal moment where Elvis is starting to appeal to everybody. And it's certainly something that, by the 70s has manifested itself in such a way that there are kids, teenagers, young adults, older generation, just the whole kaleidoscope of demographics would attend an Elvis concert, because he was appealing on so many levels to so many different people. And again, you have to give credit to Colonel Parker for that, because it made sure that Elvis was covering a wide blanket of demographics when he was recording music and putting it out into the market, that it was capturing more and more fans, and more people were becoming interested in what he was doing. And like, certainly, and another thing as well that really stands out for me is the versatility in Elvis's voice. The fact he can go from, pure rock and roll to Christmas to gospel, all within the space of these first few albums, and this side of Germany and this side of the service it's phenomenal versatility when you consider, this is a guy who's 22 years of age, and he's got the world at his fingertips, and he is managing, with some guidance, to really capture a lot of people in loads of different demographics with his music and his style. And RCA, to their credit, are putting a lot of effort behind him to market him to all of these different people. And I mean, they just hit a home run with this Christmas album. They really did.
Yeah, do you know what? This really shows your marketing side. I'd watched that clip a few times and I didn't pick up on, okay, it's marketing to two completely different demographics here. You're right, though. It's a marketing mastermind. But yeah, and I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of maybe one of my great grandparents who, was convinced Elvis played the devil's music, and then all of a sudden I'm hearing a clip of him singing "There'll Be Peace in the Valley." Yeah. But just like. Yeah. Okay. And then this was and this I thought really played on. Okay, Elvis he has become a household name by this stage through largely certainly helped by all his TV appearances, and now his albums are being promoted on television. Dedicated ads, which I'm sure were played at primetime slots. I didn't go back and look at that, but no doubt they were. And they really were, I suppose, one of the first heavy adopters of television, this new medium of television. They were probably even newer than we are to the podcast world, Martin. You know that?
I know, yeah. They were ahead of the times. And to Colonel Parker's credit, it was something that he and RCA both pushed with Elvis, was to embrace the new medium as it was of television, and to have Elvis effectively coast to coast as far as, or as much as possible, through television and through cinema as well. Because as Elvis said himself, you have a hit record and then you go to Hollywood and you start making pictures. And, at this point, Elvis has made 3 pictures. He's made Love Me Tender, Loving You, and Jailhouse Rock. He'll go on to make King Creole after this, and then he'll go into the army. But these 3 pictures that he's made so far are 3 of the 33 that he will make during his lifetime. So he has another 30 films that he's going to star in from this point forward.
More films than studio albums. It's insane. And one of the questions, when I started researching around this album for this episode, one of the questions I had was, okay, there's a full year between Elvis' second studio album and this album. And one of my initial questions was, okay, what's happened in that year? Why was he so quiet? And then I went and looked, and he wasn't quiet. He didn't release a studio album, but he had, I think, 6 singles out, 3 movies. And he had done most of the soundtracks off those movies. I think Love Me Tender, I don't think he'd done all the songs. I think maybe 4 or 5 of the songs on that one. So he was busy in this year. Like it wasn't like he took a break and enjoyed all his money from the first 2 albums. He kept going. Yeah,
no, he's exceptionally busy. And he was still touring and making TV appearances.
Still doing TV appearances.
Yeah. The Ed Sullivan Show was taking place around this time. And he finishes the Ed Sullivan Show appearances this year in 57. And he's not back on television again until he comes back from the army to the Frank Sinatra Welcome Home Elvis special on the Frank Sinatra Timex show. So it's definitely a theme for the rest of Elvis's life. I mean, at some periods in the 60s, Elvis was making up to 3 movies a year, which is, I mean, if you think about it in today's terms, it's an incredible turnaround. 3 movies, 3 soundtrack albums, and his usual, contract for studio albums and also singles that he has to put out for RCA. So he certainly worked, and he worked very hard. And that was definitely a theme for all of his life. He worked exceptionally hard.
Yeah, and it was actually just before, I think 3 or 4 weeks before this album was released, the single of Jailhouse Rock was released, and I know there's a lot of attention around this movie. So it wasn't around this time. They weren't just trying to sell the Christmas album; they're also trying to sell this movie, which was released then a few weeks after. I think it all happened kind of in quick succession. But not only that, throughout the year, we talked last week around how back then not every single belonged to an album. And he was busy releasing singles as well. So we had Too Much, All Shook Up, which I think everybody would know, Let Me Be Your Teddy Bear, Party, and then Jailhouse Rock, as I just mentioned. So what was the, for Elvis, what was, because his attention seems to be in a lot of different places at this time. But what was Elvis really trying to achieve during this time? Like, what was he trying to be a movie star? Was he trying to continue his rock career? Like, why was there such a broad range of interests?
Good question. I think I can answer the first part of it quite easily. Elvis wanted to be a movie star, and so his focus would have been trying to be a movie star. He was starting to become, not too much at this point, but certainly later on, he becomes frustrated in having to sing so much in his movies. He really does. And
okay,
I think Elvis, from like conversations that his friends have had since he passed, that they said that they had with him, certainly felt that his earlier movies, so Jailhouse Rock, King Creole, Love Me Tender, Loving You, were his best work as far as acting goes. And yeah, so to answer the first part of that question, Elvis most certainly wanted to be a movie star at this point, but it was his voice and his charisma and all of that, the whole package, is what was really driving the Presley phenomenon, the Elvis phenomenon, as it was starting to become in popular culture at that time. And like the success he was having during these few years is really it was totally unparalleled at the time. It's still nearly to this day is unparalleled, and he just exploded onto the scene. But Elvis made no secret of the fact that he wanted to be a movie star. He really did want to be a movie star. He wanted to be taken seriously in movies. He recorded Loving You. That was the second movie. He never watched that movie back because his mother and father are in the audience in that movie. And after his mother passed, he found it too difficult to watch the movie again. So he never watched it after she died. And Gladys Presley passes away just before Elvis actually goes to Germany. So it's a very emotional time for him that's about to happen. So he's on the cusp of that happening now as well, unbeknownst to him. He's starting to enter a huge emotional period in his life where he's having to go to the service in Germany. He's worried about what his career is going to look like. He's worried about, his music career. He's worried about his film career. And his mother, unfortunately, passes away just before Elvis actually goes to Germany. So he has to come back to Memphis because she's rushed to hospital and she dies. And he then has to go to Germany just a few weeks later, absolutely distraught. Elvis and his mother shared an incredible bond, and he was really, really close to his mother. George Klein said that there were two things that Elvis never got over in his entire life. One was the loss of his mother, and the second was his divorce from Priscilla, according to George Klein, who was one of Elvis's best friends. So this is a really pivotal point in his life that he's about to encounter, and it's very tragic. I mean, if you put yourself in his shoes, to lose a parent and then have to move, halfway around the world, while a career is taking off and has all of that uncertainty, it must be
essentially have.
Yeah.
And this album that we're talking about here, Elvis's Christmas album, was October 15th, 1957. So when did his mother pass away?
His mother passed away in 58.
58, and then it was very shortly after that, you said, that's when he was drafted into the army, and he obviously had to do his 2 years of service.
So his mother knew he was going into the army, and Elvis was actually away preparing to go into the army. So he was with the military away, but his mother becomes very sick, and Elvis has to come back to Memphis, and unfortunately she passes away in Memphis, and it just, I mean, there's photos of Elvis from around that time period, and he's just devastated, absolutely devastated, as anyone would be with the loss of a parent. Elvis's connection with his mother was very, very strong. I mean, Vernon, Elvis's father, at one point spent time in jail after he forged a check to feed the family. So Elvis and Gladys were on their own, and he just formed such a huge bond with his mother. His mother used to walk him to school. She used to walk him to the school even when he was too old to be walked to school, shall we say. So she was very protective of him, and he was very protective of her as well. So it's a very emotional time for him that he's about to embark upon, and it's tough. I mean, you can't help but feel sorry for the guy that he's having all of the success, but then in the middle of it, he's thrust into a totally unknown period and worry about having to go to the army, with what's going to happen with his career, and then obviously his mother passing as well, and it's that connection with his mother. I mean, any interviews where Elvis talks about Gladys or his mother or anything like that, you can just sense the love and devotion he had for her. So it's very sad. So this is the last studio album that his mother would have heard from Elvis as well.
Right. Okay. And it's and like you mentioned how close they are. So if before we started recording this podcast, Emma, my wife, is actually very, I wouldn't say very big into Elvis, but she would have watched a lot of Elvis documentaries. I think she describes it as she has this weird obsession with dead celebrities. So she would have watched a lot of Elvis documentaries, and one of them, I can't remember the title, but it really focused on his early childhood. And we mentioned in an earlier episode how he came from poverty, but it's not like poverty as we know today. This was like pure, literally have nothing poverty. And his mother really did hold him together while his father was away for the few years. So yeah, you can kind of really understand that bond that they had, and all that happened in such quick succession. Like that's,
yeah, absolutely. And yeah, like he idolized his mother. You know, he famously said he bought Graceland for his mother, for Gladys.
Yeah.
The pink Cadillac that Elvis owns, which is still on display at Graceland, such an iconic car in like rock and roll history. Elvis bought that for Gladys. Yeah. So it's his relationship with his mother is so close, and she played such an important part for him in his life, and all the different areas that they lived in around Memphis. You know, you touched on the fact that they came from poverty. Like in Tupelo, they were exceptionally poor. They literally had no money. There wasn't, as we know it today, much social security going on in the United States at that time. So, you know, the government wasn't really supporting people if they weren't able to support themselves. There was no safeguards in place. So, you know, that is why Vernon forged the check, literally to feed the family. And, you know, even when Elvis was born, they couldn't pay the doctor. So the state actually ended up paying for that doctor's visit for the birth of Elvis in Tupelo. Okay. So yeah, it's a sad period that he's about to embark on, and it's remarkable kind of how much growing up he does over the next 2 years in going to the army and coming to terms, obviously, emotionally with the passing of his mother. He forms some incredibly close friendships in the army with Charlie Hodge on the boat on the way over, who is sharing a room with Elvis and just hears him weeping so much in the bunk over the loss of his mother. Charlie goes on to end up living at Graceland and becoming part of Elvis's Memphis Mafia, and also being on stage with Elvis for all of his concerts going forward. Joe Esposito, he meets in the army as well. Joe goes on to become Elvis's road manager and foreman of the group. Yeah. Colonel loves Joe because he's very organized. He takes notes of everything. He keeps track of expenses. Vernon, Elvis's father, really likes Joe as well because he's doing all that. So, you know, before Joe is on the scene, Elvis goes out and spends money and they're not really sure where the money is gone. With Joe there, he's keeping track of where it's gone. So at least they understand where Elvis is spending the money. And he becomes such a close part of Elvis's life. And of course, also in the army, Elvis meets Priscilla in Bad Nauheim in Germany. So it's who goes on to become his wife and the mother of his only child, Lisa Marie. It's such a huge 2 years that he's about to embark upon, 2 to 3 years, where he forms all of these really close friendships and relationships that become part of his life until his dying day.
And I think we'll be able to chat a lot about those few years in the next episode. But one thing that really jumped out, and you've listed all these guys that he met in the army, and I obviously knew these names, mostly because you'd mentioned them when we were able to go to the pub and drink. But I didn't realize he'd met them while he was in the army. And if you think about it, right, this guy, he's an international rock star. All the girls love him. He might have a reputation of being a bit of a pretty boy, and you would imagine when he goes into the army, he's going to have a bit of a hard time. But it sounds like he actually got on well with people, and he built good, strong relationships, and came out of it with obviously some lifelong friends. That's a pretty interesting take. I would have imagined I don't want to make it sound like going into the army is an easy thing, but I would have imagined he'd have a much harder time personally than he did. But it sounds like he found some good, strong connections there.
Yeah, he did. And, one of the things he was very conscious of was he didn't want any special treatment in the army. He also, because he didn't want to create division amongst the other soldiers in the army. There was options for him to go into the entertainment division in the army, which he declined. Now, there's two takes on why Elvis declined that. The first is that Elvis wanted to be a regular GI, which I firmly believe. But secondly, the Colonel didn't want him performing for free. Colonel always thought that you had to get paid if you were performing because that was your talent. So Colonel didn't want him performing for free. And Colonel stepped in and tried to prevent him from performing a few times when he was asked to perform at certain events for the army. So it's interesting, but like when he does go to Germany, Vernon goes with him, his father, Minnie May, his grandmother, who's Vernon's mother, Minnie May goes as well. And Elvis also brings two friends of his with him. One is Red West, who he was in Hume's high school with, and the other is Lamar Fike. So all of them end up going to Germany, and they have a really wild time. I mean, between rental houses and having to move to different houses because they're having too many parties, or they're just horsing around too much. And he forms then, when he's in the army, these really strong relationships with a few people. Some of them are quite transitionary insofar as like they're part of Elvis's life when he's in the army, and then they're not post-army. But there are some strong ones such as Charlie Hodge and Joe Esposito that become really integral parts of his life in the army, but also when he comes back, and they come to work for him.
Yeah. Okay. We'll talk a bit more about the army in the next episode, but I'm going to not wrap it up. I'm going to put you on the spot again, and make you pick your favorite song in the album, and then your least favorite song.
Favorite song, I'll Be Home for Christmas. Least favorite song, I don't know if I have a least favorite song on this album, to be honest.
Okay. I'll tell you what mine is.
What's yours?
It's, take my hand, precious Lord, and it's just because I hate church organs. I hate the noise of them. I hate it sounds like they're whining, and there's a lot of that in that particular song. But other than that, I said none of the gospel songs really clicked with me. I didn't really dislike any of them. I like the last couple of albums, there was at least 2 or 3 songs where I could say, okay, I didn't really like that song, but I didn't not like them. Well, apart from that one, I didn't strongly not like them. They just didn't really click with me. But I think my 3 favorite I have flagged for this week are Here Comes Santa Claus, Blue Christmas, and I Believe. Yeah, they're my 3 top ones this week.
Absolutely.
Blue Christmas, Yeah, you can't get away from Blue Christmas. It's just such an iconic Christmas song.
It really
Like,
is.
I know you talked about it earlier on, but it's just great. Like, you can actually, I have this on my phone. I have this Christmas playlist, and every year I add a few more songs to it. And I don't know why I never had that song. So I think it's the earliest in the year I've ever added a Christmas song onto my Christmas playlist to listen to over Christmas time. White Christmas. I do have to say, it was hard to. I did say earlier on, it was hard to listen to because I was always comparing it to the very popular version. It was a good song though, and it was. I actually meant to talk to you about this earlier on, but it was actually he. I don't know what he's doing with his voice in that song. His voice is very different to the rest, and it's like he's trying to do something different with it. But I just thought it was quite interesting what he done with it. But It's again, and I can't believe I've never listened to early Elvis albums, but it's just another good album to listen to. Just lots of great songs in there, and this one will be playing in my kitchen at Christmas while I'm making food, while I'm making cocktails, Martin, to drink at Christmas. It'll be playing.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a Christmas classic. It really is, and it's interesting. I mean, when you consider the success of it, they wait 14 years to release another Christmas album until 1971. Arguably, from my own perspective, I prefer his latter Christmas album, the one from 71. Elvis Sings the Wonderful World of Christmas. And I think just from a personal perspective, I prefer Elvis's voice more mature, which is what happens obviously as he gets older. So it's quite interesting to hear the difference in his voice between the two. In the second Christmas album, that rock and roll edge is not as prevalent, although he adds it in certain tracks, but it's not as prevalent as this album. So this album, it's definitely a product of its time. It's just a great marketing ploy by RCA that has paid huge dividends for them and for Elvis, and was very well put together, very well thought out, strategically placed. As we talked earlier, it managed to appeal to a huge cross-demographic of people to increase his appeal. And obviously, it starts pushing Elvis more into different audience groups than he was historically, if you can say historically for a 22-year-old, than he was historically appealing to at that point in his career.
And we didn't even touch on that. He's still only 22.
I know, like it's absolutely incredible. Like he's 22 years of age, and he's made half a dozen TV appearances, which at that point was huge. It wasn't like today when people go on TV. It was such a big deal because there were so few stations.
Yeah.
And he's made at this juncture three films, and he's recorded 3 albums as well. It's an absolute rocket ship that he has become. And it's around this time as well that he starts to very much become Elvis, like in capital letters, Elvis, which, always makes the point in 72 when he's interviewed before he performs in Madison Square Gardens, that it's very hard to live up to an image. And it's around this period that image of Elvis is being constructed.
A bit of a silly question for you. And I know it's kind of you're comparing different markets between then and now, but who is bigger, Elvis now or Taylor Swift? Sorry, Elvis then or Taylor Swift now? If we compare him to like a popular artist today.
That even a question?
Elvis then. It sounds.
I don't mean to be facetious, but I'm not sure that nearly 60 years from now, people will be talking about Taylor Swift's albums on podcasts, or the longevity of that is just unique. It's so unique. It's like he transcends more than just music. Like he's actually a cultural force in the 20th century. Like he changes popular culture. He influences so many bands and so many rock and roll stars. Like, I mean, there's quotes from the contemporaries of his, because Elvis didn't open the door, he kicked it down. And as John Lennon said before, there was nothing. It's, and I don't mean to be facetious with that answer.
No. They're all fair points. And the angle I was going at, I think it was about a year and a half or 2 years ago, Taylor Swift had 6 songs in the top 10 on, it was the iTunes charts or one of them. Then I was gone back a few years before that, and I think Justin Bieber had something similar. I think he had 4 in the top 10. And I was trying to think to myself, okay, is there any artist that today that you can compare to back then? But the way you've described his last year, when he's just 22 years old, it does kind of put artists today to shame. You know, yeah, they're popular. You know, some of them have, you know, unquestionably catchy songs. But the way you put it there is kind of, in 60 years' time, will people be talking about them? They might recognize a few of their songs, but will they be talking about them the way people talk about Elvis? Will they be lining up to visit their house? You know, it's...
And there are good points. The other thing I think as well that's important to note is distribution and consumption were very different animals than what they are today. So, like, today you can record an album or a single, and you can distribute it electronically pretty much instantly.
It's true.
All across the world. At this point, very few television stations, very few radio stations. You have to get signed by a record label. You still have to get signed by a record label in some cases, but you have to get signed by a record label. The record label then had to press the records onto vinyl. They then had to distribute it around the country. Like, it was not, I don't want to say it was not as easy as it is now, because there's loads of artists now struggling to get recognition. And who knows, maybe if Elvis didn't break through, he could have ended up being a truck driver in Memphis for the rest of his life, and we won't be sitting here talking about it. But he got those breaks. But certainly in that time period, it was much... I think it was more difficult in that time period to get the breaks, because there was such a small pool of people that were able to get the breaks due to the limited resources in being able to amplify those people and those artists.
No, they're all really good points. And you know what? I actually threw that question at Emma last week, a few days after I started listening to this album, and I gave the Justin Bieber example, and she laughed at me as well. So yeah, I should have known that would also be your. I should have known that would be your answer. But okay, so we are now up to 1957, and we've talked that there's going to be a few years of a break because Elvis goes off to the army. What's the next album we're listening to?
So, quite imaginative from RCA. It's called Elvis is Back, which is to announce his return from the army. He'll also be on the Frank Sinatra show to announce his return from the army, and it's really a celebration of the fact that he's back. It's an album that, God, it has to be one of my favorite Elvis albums of all time. I think it's just a stunning album from start to finish. It shows the whole evolution of his voice, the whole evolution of his style. It's got so many great songs in it. His voice has matured an awful lot in the intervening years, and you'll really notice with this album, Elvis is starting to move into ballads, which he hadn't really been doing too much of prior to this. So he's maturing vocally, he's maturing as a performer, he's maturing as an artist. And when he comes out of the army, back on the Frank Sinatra show, Elvis, then they released the album Elvis is Back, and he has a bunch of #1 singles, and he's back on screen as well with GI Blues, which they start filming while he's in the army. Hal Wallace goes over to Germany to talk to Elvis about it, and it turns into a stunning success, eclipsed then by his movie shortly after that, Blue Hawaii, which was his most famous movie of all time, which probably in the end did him a slight disservice due to its phenomenal success, because it very much trapped him in the singing Beach Boy type of role. That from Blue Hawaii onwards, it's Elvis with a guitar singing songs with a kind of loose storyline, and the good soundtrack album, which starts to grate on him very much as the 60s starts to go on, because as we said earlier, you very much want to be taken seriously as a movie star, and you can't be taken seriously as a movie star when you're producing these light films, which he goes on to produce. Not to say, like, there's a lot of good films in it. I enjoy a lot of the films, but they're certainly not critically acclaimed films, and for most of the 60s, and Elvis becomes quite frustrated with them. But yeah, it's strange. You become a victim of your own success.
Yeah, that's it. Well, we'll be able to dive into that one next week, and just kind of a note. I joked about this before. Studio album 1, Elvis Presley. Studio album 2, Elvis. Studio album 3, Elvis's Christmas album. Studio album 4, Elvis is back. When does he stop getting his name onto the onto the title of every album?
The album following Elvis is back. It's his first full spiritual album called His Hand in Mine.
Okay. So, right. Okay. But he's talking about his own hand there. Like, that's right. Okay. And then I'm just really scanning back through here to see if there's any of my talking points we didn't touch on. I think we've captured everything. We know what we're listening to next week. I think we've given that year of his life a pretty good rundown. Again, we maybe in series 2 we'll come back and go a bit of a deeper dive. But I think we're good to leave it there this week.
Excellent. Fantastic. So yeah, we'll talk next week, and make sure you check out Elvis is Back, and yeah, I'd be very keen to hear what you think. And Such a Night for me is my favorite song on that album, and one of my favorite Elvis songs. So take a listen to that, and also The Girl and My Best Friend. Okay, you've really sold this one again this week, Martin. Better be good. It is. Right. Talk to you next week. Thanks, Noel. Cheers.